All right, false grip. Had a request for any tips or tricks to help make false grip a little less painful. First off, there's definitely things you can do to minimize the chances of blistering and tearing and stuff like that, but there's only so much you can do. There's definitely an element of, if it's a new movement for you, that you're gonna have to toughen up a little bit and give that skin a little bit of time to get a little thicker and get used to the motion. And same thing with the wrist, get the wrist a little bit used to the motion. But that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do to help at least minimize or reduce the amount of discomfort that you're feeling when you're starting to work with any sort of a ring muscle up or even a bar muscle up as well, but definitely this is more applicable for rings. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your wrist mobility is good. Shoulder mobility, elbow mobility, anything like that, they're also come into play, but definitely the most obvious place that people neglect and don't necessarily work on when they go to do a false grip on anything is the fact that they don't check and make sure that their wrist is actually ready for it to begin with. So if you go into your wrist flexion and extension and you've got any sort of limit on the range of motion that you have, especially in the flexion, if you try to flex your wrist without any help from gravity or a ring or anything like that, and you can't find that 90-degree flexion to begin with or better, then you're definitely going to have a struggle to try to maintain your position above the ring. So therefore the rubbing that happens where that wrist makes contact with the ring is going to become worse and worse the more tired you get, and also the worse and worse that your flexion gets. So making sure you have basic good mobility in the wrist and a strong mobility in the wrist, an active range of motion is going to be huge. So any wrist pails and rails, any wrist strengthening exercises are going to make a huge difference, but I'll give you some examples of how to make it a little bit more specific to the false grip itself. So for some pails and rails, for wrist extension, one of the things that you can do to make it a little bit more specific, I luckily have a couple racket balls here. You could use anything that's around the same diameter as what your rings, even if you got a spare set of rings sitting around, you can do it with the rings, but a nice racket ball or golf ball or anything like that that gives you something to squeeze onto and keep things active while you're in the stretch is going to make a huge difference. So coming down into an all fours position, bending the wrists into flexion, squeezing on the lacrosse ball, trying to keep your elbows straight, because one of the biggest things is when you're doing your false grip, the hardest position to get to is false grip with straight elbows or fully extended arms. So you want to try to find that fully extended arm when you're stretching your wrist, because that's going to make it so that when you're at the bottom of your pull up, at the bottom of the muscle up getting started, you're already putting your wrist in a more comfortable position, or you're getting that wrist more used to that position. So in this position, squeeze onto the lacrosse ball. Now ideally you would spend about 2 minutes here letting a passive stretch happen on the wrist, but for this case we're going to imagine that I've done 2 minutes. Then you're going to go into the active phase where you're actually thinking about where the knuckles of the hand, not the fingers, but the knuckles of the hand are connected to the floor, and you're going to push down into the floor for 10 seconds, ramping it up towards 100% intensity. And then for the second 10 seconds, or the next 10 seconds after that, you're trying to maintain that 100% activity, or that 100% resistance, trying to straighten your wrist. The floor is in the way so you don't move, but you're trying to straighten the wrist in that position. Once you've done a total of 20 seconds working on that, so you got 10 seconds ramping it up and 10 seconds maintaining that, the most intense force that you can create, then what you're going to do is you're going to go into the pulling yourself into the range of motion, where you're actually going to squeeze on that tennis ball or the lacrosse ball even more and try to lift the back of the hand off of the floor, using the flexors to try to take yourself into a deeper range of motion. Keep squeezing the ball, keep trying to make those flexors shorten, and maintain that for somewhere between 10 and 20 seconds as well, trying to find as close to 100% intensity as you can. Once you've done that, then you can relax, maybe finding a little bit easier time in the range of motion that you have, or maybe even trying to take it a little bit deeper into the range of motion. Usually 2 rounds of the ramping, or 2 rounds of the pails and rails, is going to give you a little bit more feedback, because that first round might actually allow you to go a little bit deeper, and then the second round at least is then reinforcing and strengthening that newfound range of motion that you had. So that's one example of a way that you can take a range, or take a mobility drill and just make it a little bit more specific towards a ring muscle up, or that false grip for the rings. Something else that you can work on, again, trying to make it more applicable for a false grip, is grabbing your favorite, the lightest crush grip that you can probably find to start with, and working on where your grip is the weakest. So one of the things is, with this gripper, it's super easy for me to close, but what we don't often do is we don't often put ourselves into an extreme end range of motion and then try to activate those flexors. So it's one of the reasons why most people are definitely strong enough to hold on to a ring, and they're strong enough to, without any resistance, pull themselves into a decent wrist flexion. But when you're trying to do both of those things at the same time while maintaining a position, or while trying to hold your body weight, it's those 2 things happening at the same time that completely cancel one another out and stop you from being able to do it. So anything, again, you could use a lacrosse ball or anything that you can squeeze and actually get some movement in. I've got this Captain Crush gripper. It's literally the easiest one you can get. Put myself into the deepest flexion that I can possibly be in, and then practice trying to close the gripper and maintaining that close. I can't even close it in that position at this point, but trying to close it as much as possible. There, that time I got it closed. And maintaining that position. And you could do reps like that, which would be one way, but also maintaining that rep position. This really works for your muscle up transition, is getting that false grip type position, squeezing, and then actually actively keeping it squeezed while going into a full extension, and then trying to bring it all the way back into a full flexion while maintaining that strongest grip crush that you've got, and then releasing. So again, what this is going to do is it's going to put a little bit more tension on, and a little bit more strengthening stimulus on not just the muscle tissue, but also the ligament and tendon tissue. So you're getting a little bit more of a range of motion, but you're strengthening that range of motion, which actually helps prevent injury as well. So those are 2 easy things that you can do for mobility and for strengthening end range. But something else that you can do that I've got set up here is I've got a couple of rings and then some surgical tubing. So it's very easy resistance attached to my ceiling. And then one of the things that you can also do is set yourself up to practice the transition in the wrist for your muscle up. So finding that false grip, which shouldn't be too hard when you've got really very little resistance. So making sure that the wrist is all the way above. Thinking about locking yourself in to, say, the top, or from that transition here. One of the hardest parts of the transition isn't just the getting the arms behind you part of the muscle up, but is actually the realization that there's a lot of extension required and a lot of stability in the wrist required in order to get yourself into that dip position at the bottom. So one of the things you can do to help train that is, in this position, the tubing is attached in a way that it's not going to slide. So I can actually practice my wrist extension, squeezing onto the rings and stretching that band. Again, it's not a super huge resistance. Obviously you can ramp it up, but find something that, again, allows you to practice that transition in the wrist, because this is where a lot of that rubbing and a lot of that chafing and blistering and tearing can happen, is because that transition isn't very smooth, so that the body is rubbing all over the place. The bone starts to push through the skin onto the wood. But if you can practice keeping yourself in that nice position where it's actually muscle, flesh, and skin rather than bone on the ring, and be strong through that range of motion, then you're more likely to be able to achieve that when you're actually putting all the forces together. So again, it's just taking one part of the movement, isolating it, and trying to get a little bit stronger before you put all things together. This is a good position to practice in because this is where that extension is actually going to occur when you're coming onto the top. But then another very vulnerable and weak part of the movement for people new to the false grip in ring work is when the arms are fully extended. So something else that you can do is lying down, or if you've got a ceiling high enough you can do this standing up, is put yourself into that same position with the false grip, even rotating it out, mimicking what it would be like to be at that full hang at the bottom, and then actually rotating in and then extending the wrist. Again, simply practicing that full range of motion the best you can to mimic and just start to prep the area, because this is also going to teach that skin to get a little bit tougher without having to tear anything, and trying to maintain that nice straight elbow. Again, just breaking down the parts into more manageable bites. Again, there's only so much you can do to prep it. The skin is going to have to get tougher, but by breaking down the mobility of the wrist, you're definitely going to take some of the aches and pains, and especially some of the delays in training. If you go too hard and that does tear and rip, you're going to have to wait for it to, well, most likely you should wait until that heals before you continue to move on, unless you want to aggravate it and keep it open. So stuff like this can actually help mitigate that and make it so that your training can be a little bit speedier, even if you do have to break it down a little bit slower to begin with. Anyways, I hope something here made sense and can help you with your ring false grip. Thanks.